I don't necessarily think that the U.S. was right to bomb Iran. However, I don't understand why Prime Minister Ishiba decided to skip the NATO summit, but I don't think that he should have attended NATO summits in the first place. Therefore, I think that PM Ishiba made the right decision to skip the NATO summit. To begin with, I don't think Japan should be involved with NATO. The U.S. bombed Iran, bombed its nuclear facilities, and Iran had no choice but to do something in retaliation. Therefore, Iran gave advance notice, even if only through Qatar, to the U.S. and then bombed U.S. military bases in Qatar. Because of that, I think there was almost no damage. Also, there are certainly many U.S. military bases in Japan. For example, in the event of an emergency in Taiwan, U.S. military aircraft could fly from U.S. military bases there to Taiwan, and there is a risk that U.S. military bases in Japan would be targeted in response. Therefore, even if it takes time in the future, I think we should create a Japan without U.S. military bases. I believe that the situation in which Japan's defense, security, and peace being protected by U.S. military bases should be improved as soon as possible. The Japan-U.S. Status of Forces Agreement is a system where that even if U.S. soldiers commit various violent crimes, it is difficult for Japan to immediately get involved. As a result, various assaults, incidents, and sexual crimes still occur. I believe that this should never happen, and that the Japanese government should make more strict requests to the U.S. government about this. But it seems that we are still in an era where the Japanese government is unable to speak out strongly to the U.S. I believe this is an issue that goes to the very core of Japan-U.S. security, and if things like this continue, like the time when, during the PM Hashimoto administration, when Ambassador Mondale was in office, a U.S. soldier committed a sexual assault against a Japanese girl, and it was a very serious situation. And it was said that this was an issue that went straight to the core of Japan-U.S. security. And if things continued as they were, Japanese people might get angry, and U.S. military bases might be asked to leave. In a sense, such things are still happening today. But I can't help but feel that the Japanese people's response to these crimes committed by the U.S. military has become weaker. I think Japan should be more neutral towards this so-called Ukrainian war, and we should do everything we can to bring about a ceasefire so that the Ukrainian war can end as soon as possible. Unfortunately, the Japanese government decided to support Ukraine as soon as Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022. I do not agree with that way of thinking. We need to think more about why such a war happened and its causes. In fact, the problem began around the time of the overthrow of the Yanukovych Ukrainian government in 2014, when the Ukrainian government was extremely harsh towards areas where most Russians live, including Donbass. These things were the cause of the war, and in particular, Ukraine's desire to join NATO, which led to the war. Therefore, I think the Japanese government needs to take a good look at the causes of the war and be more neutral than simply supporting Ukraine. The reason why this has happened is that Japan has become dependent on Western, especially American, thinking. And this war was started by the U.S. with the idea of being tough on Russia and weakening its power. So the fact that Japan has sided with the U.S. has led to its support for Ukraine. I strongly hope that the Japanese government will wake up soon. When I was in power, we had fairly good relations with China and South Korea. I believe in the idea of unlimited responsibility regarding so-called historical issues. In other words, a defeated country cannot say that it is over because we have paid some reparations. I believe that we must continue to feel apologetic in some sense until the victorious countries and former colonies understand that they do not need to do anything more and that they understand. With this mindset, there are still historical issues remaining, such as the issue of so-called comfort women and the various issues of forced laborers. So if we approach these issues from a position of unlimited responsibility, I believe that China and South Korea will eventually show understanding. At least when I was in power, this was the mindset, and they showed understanding. I believe that the Japanese government must once again return to this mindset. PM Ishiba and Minister Akazawa are making efforts. However, the problem is that NATO and NATO countries are said to increase their defense and military spending to 5% of GDP in the future at the request of the United States. In the midst of the tariff war and tariff discussions, we will lower the tariffs a little, but in return you will buy more weapons and weapons. There are also talks of not 2% of GDP, but 3.5 and even 5%. There's a possibility that they will say, buy more weapons to that extent. It is true that if we buy weapons, the so-called balance of trade will change, but I am against solving the tariff problem by buying such weapons. I think that the discussion on tariffs should be separated from the so-called defense spending issue, and a conclusion should be reached through proper discussion. But I think it will be difficult for the current Ishiba administration to fight Trump on an equal footing. In other words, we are concerned that there will be significant tariffs imposed on automobiles and other issues. PM Ishiba says that Japan's economic situation is worse than Greece's, but I don't think so. There is no doubt that Japan is also in a difficult situation with deficit bonds and government bonds. However, when you consider that the majority of those government bonds are purchased by Japanese people themselves, I think that the problem is different from that of Greece. However, I believe that over the past 30 years, especially since the second term of PM Abe, when Abenomics began, Japan has been increasingly overtaken by other countries, and that this is due to delays in investment in so-called advanced technology. When we should have put more effort into innovation and advanced technology, we did not put enough into it. In a sense, Abenomics caused stocks to rise and the yen to weaken, so trade and exports naturally did well. However, just because exports were strong and goods were sold overseas does not mean that our technological capabilities have improved, but rather that we did not put more effort into researching advanced technology at a time when we should have done so, and I think that this is a big problem. Even now, China and the United States are putting a lot of effort into these types of innovations. So I am concerned that if Japan does not put in more effort, it will fall further and further behind. I think President Trump is relentless and tough on tariffs, whether they are on allies or not. I think that in the end, the U.S. will try to find a solution to this tariff issue through a deal with countries that are tough on the U.S. In that situation, I think that if it becomes difficult for Japan to sell its products to the U.S. because of tariffs, it would be good if it could sell more to other countries. And for that to happen, it is important to create a better environment with countries that are willing to buy the products that Japan could export, whether they are allies or not. In that sense, since we have RCEP, CPTPP, and other such agreements, I think we need to make efforts to sell more Japanese products overseas through free trade with such countries and reduce the influence of the U.S. Many Russians visit Japan, and Japanese people also love Russian culture. Therefore, in terms of culture or tourism, ordinary Japanese and ordinary Russians are by no means fighting with each other. On the contrary, there are many people who want to maintain good relations. I think we should create an environment where such people can have more tourism or cultural exchange, for example. When I thought about it, the Japanese government supported Ukraine, and Japan, which should have been neutral, broke its neutrality and took one side. I think it was a mistake to unilaterally decide that Russia was bad and Zelensky was right, without studying history sufficiently and learning the true cause of why this war occurred. I think the Japanese government needs to realize this mistake soon. But it seems that Japan is in a relationship with the United States and the so-called G7 developed countries and criticizing Russia, which is why this kind of contradiction has arisen. I believe this is causing a great deal of damage to the national interests of both countries. I'm not planning to visit Donbass at the moment. I visited Crimea in 2015. As you know, Crimea has a lot of history. During Khrushchev's time, Ukraine was still a part of Russian territory, and Crimea was handed over to Ukraine. Because of this history, there are many Russians and people of Russian descent living in Crimea. As a result, Crimea decided its own autonomy through an election, a vote. I actually went to see the situation. When I asked local people about it, they told me that no matter how many times we vote, it won't change anything. And the more we vote, the more votes there are in favor of joining Russia. I think that is the case. Therefore, because of this historical background, Crimea's belonging to Russia is the right solution that the residents of the region would be grateful for, and I believe it should remain that way. I've heard that many people in the Donbass region are of Russian descent. I've heard that the Ukrainian government has exerted considerable pressure on these people, committing some pretty severe acts of slaughter. Therefore, isn't it right to reach a conclusion in the direction that the local residents want? That is the region's autonomy, isn't it? And recognizing that is the right solution internationally as well. This August marks 80 years since the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And today, the world is still in a dire situation where atomic bombs, or rather nuclear weapons, could be used again. Therefore, I believe that the Japanese government, as the only country to have suffered a nuclear attack in a war, should send out a message. At this major turning point of 80 years, I believe that we need to send a message to the world that nuclear weapons must never be used. As expected, President Obama and others from the United States came to Hiroshima, but they did not apologize. I sincerely hoped that they would have done so. It was unfortunate. Even now, some ordinary citizens feel that an apology should be made, but unfortunately, no politician, especially the president, has ever apologized for the atomic bomb. Rather, there is a tendency to justify the atomic bombing by saying that it brought an early end to the war. This time, too, President Trump appears to have cited Hiroshima and Nagasaki, saying, quote, "The ceasefire was brought about by airstrikes in Iran, which is just like what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But I do not support that way of thinking. After all, no matter what, we should not use weapons that kill large numbers of our people. I believe that in order to stop the war, we should not have fought, but rather have made efforts to find a solution by seeking answers through dialogue. In that sense, I am disappointed that such justifications for Hiroshima and Nagasaki are still being made in the United States. Japan has always had a mindset of being subordinate to the United States, and as a result, in the current Ukrainian war, it supports Ukraine and criticizes Russia. Also, we should be calling for much stronger responsibility and an apology from the United States for the atomic bombings. But unfortunately, we do not hear such strong voices of criticism, which I think is truly unfortunate. In that sense, I believe that Japan, which is currently subordinate to the United States, needs to become more independent. Nagasaki's authorities' plan inviting Russia and Belarus to their commemorative events could have a very positive impact on Russia, and I am grateful for the decision by the mayor of Nagasaki, and I believe it to be correct. I'm sure there were many different thoughts behind it, but there is no doubt that the citizens who were exposed to the atomic bombings desire world peace in their hearts. The same should be said to the United States, but Russia also has nuclear weapons, so I think it would be very desirable if they come to the ceremony and feel that we should both stop using nuclear weapons. At times like these, I think we should stop saying that the United States or the G7 are our allies, but that we have a different view of Russia, Iran, or China. However, Hiroshima City has its own decision, and Nagasaki City has its own decision, starting with the mayor, and they are different, and each makes a decision based on the times, so I think it's possible that they will decline. However, I think that both should be open to all countries without discrimination, and that look at the history of Hiroshima, look at the history of Nagasaki. Therefore, nuclear weapons must never be used. It is important to let the world know that, so I think it would be strange to judge this person as okay and this person as not okay. I believe the Japanese government made a mistake in its judgment regarding the Ukraine war. After all, history is not something that should be judged based on a single event, and I believe that a judgment should not have been made after carefully looking at the historical background. Therefore, I believe Japan should take a more neutral stance regarding the Ukraine war and, if possible, cooperate more with China and others in how to bring the war to a ceasefire as quickly as possible. Fortunately, in a sense, President Trump has also said that the Ukraine war should be ended quickly, and that he would end it. So I think it is necessary to cooperate with President Trump quickly, not only on the issue of tariffs, but also on issues like this, and to make known the significance of Japan's presence in some way. If I were in that position, I don't think I would have been inclined to support Ukraine from the start. I believe that many Russians have a favorable view of Japan. It would be extremely unfortunate if Japan were to lean towards supporting Ukraine on this issue and end up being critical of Russia as a result. So I think Japan itself should quickly learn from history and lead the way to correct Japan-Russia relations. In that sense, I believe the various economic and non-economic sanctions against Russia should also be lifted as soon as possible.